Atlas Shrugged is a 1957 novel by Ayn Rand's fourth and last novel. It was also her longest, and the one she considered to be her magnum opus in the realm of fiction writing. Atlas Shrugged includes elements of science fiction, mystery, and romance, and it contains Rand's most extensive statement of objectivism in any of her works of fiction. The book depicts a dystopian United States, wherein many of society's most prominent and successful industrialists abandon the fortunes and even the nation, in response to aggressive new regulations, whereupon most vital industries collapse. The title is a reference to Atlas, a titan described in the novel as the giant who holds the world on his shoulders. The significance of this reference appears in a conversation between the characters Francisco d'Anconia and Hank Reardon, in which d'Anconia asks Reardon what advice he would give Atlas upon seeing that the greater effort, the heavier the world bore down on his shoulders. With Reardon unable to answer, d'Anconia gives his own response. To shrug. The theme of Atlas Shrugged, as Rand described it, bullshit the role of man's mind in existence. The book explores a number of philosophical themes from which Rand would subsequently develop objectivism. In doing so, it expresses the advocacy of reason, individualism, capitalism, and the failures of governmental coercion. Atlas Shrugged received largely negative reviews after its 1957 publication, but achieved enduring popularity and consistent sales in the following decades. History, context and writing. Rand's stated goal for writing the novel was to show how desperately the world needs prime movers and how viciously it treats them, and to portray what happens to a world without them. The core idea for the book came to her after a 1943 telephone conversation with a friend, who asserted that Rand owed it to her readers to write fiction about her philosophy. Rand replied, "What if I went on strike? What if all the creative minds of the world went on strike?" Rand then began Atlas Shrugged to depict the morality of rational self-interest, by exploring the consequences of a strike by intellectuals refusing to supply their inventions, art, business leadership, scientific research, or new ideas to the rest of the world. The working title throughout her writing was The Strike, but Rand, having thought this title would have revealed the mystery element of the novel prematurely, she was pleased when her husband suggested Atlas Shrugged, previously the title of a single chapter, for the book. To produce Atlas Shrugged, Rand conducted research on the American railroad industry. Her previous work on a proposed screenplay based on the development of the atomic bomb, including her interviews of J. Robert Oppenheimer, was used in the portrait of the character Robert Stadler and the novel's depiction of the development of Project X. To do further background research, Rand toured and inspected a number of industrial facilities, such as the Kaiser Steel plant, rode the locomotives of the New York Central Railroad, and even learned to operate the locomotive of the 20th Century Limited. Rand's self-identified literary influences include Victor Hugo, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Edmond Rostand, and O. Henry. In addition, Justin Raimondo has observed similarities between Atlas Shrugged and the 1922 novel The Driver, written by Garrett, which concerns an idealized industrialist named Henry Gall, who is a transcontinental railway owner trying to improve the world and fighting against government and socialism. In contrast, Chris Matthews Sayabara found Raimondo's claims that Rand plagiarized The Driver to be unsupported, and Stephen Kinsella doubts that Rand was in any way influenced by Garrett. Writer Bruce Ramsey observed, "Both The Driver and Atlas Shrugged have to do with running railroads during an economic depression, and both suggest pro-capitalist ways in which the country might get out of the depression. But in plot, character, tone, and theme they are very different." Atlas Shrugged was Rand's last completed work of fiction. It marked a turning point in her life, the end of her career as a novelist and the beginning of her role as a popular philosopher. Publishing history due to the success of Rand's 1943 novel The Fountainhead, she had no trouble attracting a publisher for Atlas Shrugged. This was a contrast to her previous novels, which she had struggled to place. Even before she began writing it, she had been approached by publishers interested in her next novel. However, her contract for The Fountainhead gave the first option to its publisher, Bobbs Merrill Company. After reviewing a partial manuscript, they asked her to discuss a number of cuts and other changes. She refused, and Bobbs Merrill rejected the book. Hiram Hayden, an editor she liked who had left Bobbs Merrill, asked her to consider his new employer, Random House. In an early discussion about the difficulties of publishing a controversial novel, Random House president Bennett Cerf proposed that Rand should submit the manuscript to multiple publishers simultaneously and ask how they would respond to its ideas, so she could evaluate who might best promote her work. Rand was impressed by the bold suggestion and by her overall conversations with them. After speaking with a few other publishers, of about a dozen who were interested, Rand decided a multiple submission was not needed. She offered the manuscript to Random House. Upon reading the portion Rand submitted, Cerf declared it a great book, and offered Rand a contract. It was the first time Rand had worked with a publisher whose executives seemed truly enthusiastic about one of her books. Random House published the novel on October 10, 1957. The initial print run was 100,000 copies. The first paperback edition was published by New American Library in July 1959, with an initial run of 150,000. A 35th anniversary edition was published by E.P. Dutton in 1992, with an introduction by Rand's heir, Leonard Peikoff. Many translations have been published, including editions in Albanian, Bulgarian, Chinese, Danish, Dutch, French, German, Hebrew, Icelandic, Italian, Japanese, Marathi, Mongolian, Polish, Portuguese, Russian, Spanish, Slovak, Swedish, Turkish, and Ukrainian. Synopsis. Setting. Atlas Shrugged is set in a dystopian United States at an unspecified time, in which the country has a national legislature instead of Congress and a head of state instead of a president. Writer Edward Younkins noted, the story may be simultaneously described as anachronistic and timeless. The pattern of industrial organization appears to be that of the late 1800s. The mood seems to be close to that of the Depression-era 1930s. Both the social customs and the level of technology remind one of the 1950s. Many early 20th century technologies are available, and the steel and railroad industries are especially significant. Jet planes are described as a relatively new technology, and television is significantly less influential than radio. Although other countries are mentioned in passing, the Soviet Union, World War II, or the Cold War are not. The countries of the world are implied to be organized along vaguely Marxist lines, with references to people's states in Europe and South America. Characters also refer to nationalization of businesses in these people's states, as well as in America. The economy of the book's present is contrasted with the capitalism of 19th-century America, recalled as a lost golden age. Structure. The novel is divided into 3 parts consisting of 10 chapters each. Robert James Bidonotto noted, the titles of the parts and chapters suggest multiple layers of meaning. The 3 parts, for example, are named in honor of Aristotle's laws of logic. Part 1 is titled Non-Contradiction. Part 2, titled Either or. Part 3 is titled A is a reference to the law of identity. Plot summary. As the novel opens, protagonist Dagny Taggart, the operating vice president of Taggart Transcontinental, a railroad company established by her grandfather, attempts to keep the company alive against collectivism and statism. Her brother, James Taggart, the railroad's president, is peripherally aware of the company's troubles but seems to make her irrational decisions, such as preferring to buy steel from Warren Boyle's Associated Steel, rather than Hank Rearden's Rearden Steel, despite the former continually delaying delivery of vital rail. In this as in other decisions, Dagny simply continues her own policy, but is herself disappointed to discover that Francisco d'Anconia, her childhood friend and first love, appears to be destroying his family's international copper company without cause. Hank Rearden, a self-made steel magnate, has developed an alloy called Rearden metal, now the most reliable metal in the world, but keeps its composition secret, sparking jealousy among competitors. As a result, pressure is put on Dagny to use conventional steel, but she refuses. Hank's career is hindered by his feelings of obligation to his wife, mother, and younger brother. Dagny also becomes acquainted with Wesley Moosh, a Washington lobbyist initially working for Rearden, whom he betrays, and later notices the nation's most capable business leaders abruptly disappearing, leaving their industries to failure. The most recent of these is Ellis Wyatt, the sole founder and supervisor of Wyatt Oil, who leaves his most successful oil well spewing petroleum and fire into the air. Each of these men remains absent despite a thorough search by politicians. While economic conditions worsen and government agencies enforce the control on successful businesses, the citizens are often heard repeating, "Who is John Galt?" in response to questions to which the individual has no answer. It sarcastically means, don't ask important questions, because we don't have answers, or more broadly, what's the point? Or why bother? Having demonstrated the reliability of Rearden metal in a railroad line named after John Galt, Hank Rearden and Dagny Taggart become paramours, and later discover, amongst the ruins of an abandoned factory, an incomplete motor that transforms atmospheric static electricity into kinetic energy, of which they seek the inventor. Eventually, this search reveals the reason of business leaders' disappearances, when Dagny pursues a scientist to Galt's Gulch, where the character John Galt is leading an organized strike of business leaders against the government. Reluctant to forsake her railroad, Dagny leaves Galt's Gulch, but Galt follows Dagny to New York City, where he hacks into a national radio broadcast to deliver a long speech to explain the novel's theme and Rand's objectivism. As the government collapses, the authorities capture Galt, but he is rescued by his partisans, while New York City loses its electricity. The novel closes as Galt announces that they will later reorganize the world. Themes. Philosophy. The story of Atlas Shrugged dramatically expresses Rand's ethical egoism, her advocacy of rational selfishness, whereby all of the principal virtues and vices are applications of the role of reason as man's basic tool of survival. Rationality, honesty, justice, independence, integrity, productiveness, and pride. Rand's characters often personify her view of the archetypes of various schools of philosophy for living and working in the world. Robert James Bidonotto wrote, Rand rejected the literary convention that depth and plausibility demand characters who are naturalistic replicas of the kinds of people we meet in everyday life, uttering everyday dialogue and pursuing everyday values. But she also rejected the notion that characters should be symbolic rather than realistic. And Rand herself stated, "My characters are never symbols, they are merely men in sharper focus than the audience can see with unaided sight." My characters are persons in whom certain human attributes are focused more sharply and consistently than in average human beings. In addition to the plot's more obvious statements about the significance of industrialists to society, and the sharp contrast to Marxism and a labor theory of value, this explicit conflict is used by Rand to draw wider philosophical conclusions, both implicit in the plot and via the characters' own statements. Atlas Shrugged caricatures fascism, socialism, communism, and any state intervention in society as allowing poor people to leech the hard-earned wealth of the rich, and Rand contends that the outcome of any individual's life is purely a function of its ability, and that any individual could overcome adverse circumstances, given ability and intelligence. Sanction of the victim. The concept sanction of the victim is defined by Leonard Peikoff as the willingness of the good to suffer at the hands of the evil, to accept the role of sacrificial victim for the sin of creating values. Accordingly, throughout Atlas Shrugged, numerous characters are frustrated by this sanction, as when Hank Rearden appears duty-bound to support his family, despite the hostility toward him. Later, the principle is stated by Dan Conway: "I suppose somebody's got to be sacrificed. If it turned out to be me, I have no right to complain." John Galt further explains the principle: "Evil is impotent and has no power but that which we let it extort from us, and I saw that evil was impotent, and the only weapon of its triumph was the willingness of the good to serve it." Government and business. Rand's view of the ideal government is expressed by John Galt: "The political system we will build is contained in a single moral premise. No man may obtain any values from others by resorting to physical force, whereas no rights can exist without the right to translate one's rights into reality, to think, to work and to keep the results, which means the right of property." Galt himself lives a life of laissez-faire capitalism. At the end of the book, when the protagonists get ready to return and claim the ravaged world, Judge Narragansett drafts a new amendment to the United States Constitution. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of production and trade. He is also marking and crossing out the contradictions in the Constitution's existing text. In the world of Atlas Shrugged, society stagnates when independent, productive agencies are socially demonized for their accomplishments. This is in agreement with an excerpt from a 1964 interview with Playboy magazine, in which Rand states, "What we have today is not a capitalist society, but a mixed economy, that is, a mixture of freedom and controls, which, by the presently dominant trend, is moving toward dictatorship." The action in Atlas Shrugged takes place at a time when society has reached the stage of dictatorship. When and if this happens, that will be the time to go on strike, but not until then. Rand also depicts public choice theory, such that the language of altruism is used to pass legislation nominally in the public interest, but more to the short-term benefit of special interests and government agencies. Property rights and individualism. Rand's heroes continually oppose parasites, looters, and moochers who demand the benefits of the hero's labor. Edward Younkins describes Atlas Shrugged as an apocalyptic vision of the last stages of conflict between two classes of humanity, the looters and the non-looters. The looters are proponents of high taxation, big labor, government ownership, government spending, government planning, regulation, and redistribution. Looters are Rand's depiction of bureaucrats and government officials who confiscate others' earnings by the implicit threat of force. Some officials execute government policy, such as those who confiscate one state's seed grain to feed the starving citizens of another. Others exploit those policies, such as the railroad regulator who illegally sells the railroad's supplies for his own profit. Both use force to take property from the people who produced or earned it. Moochers are Rand's depiction of those unable to produce value themselves, who demand others' earnings on behalf of the needy, but resent the talented upon whom they depend, and appeal to moral right while enabling the lawful seizure by governments. The character Francisco d'Anconia indicates the role of looters in relation to money itself. So you think that money is the root of all evil. Have you ever asked what is the root of money? Money is a tool of exchange, which can't exist unless there are goods produced and men able to produce them. Money is the material shape of the principle that men who wish to deal with one another must deal by trade and give value for value. Money is not the tool of the moochers who claim your product by tears, or the looters who take it from you by force. Money is made possible only by the men who produce. Is this what you consider evil? Not an ocean of tears nor all the guns in the world can transform those pieces of paper in your wallet into bread you need to survive tomorrow. Whenever destroyers appear among men, they start by destroying money, for money is men's protection and the base of a moral existence. Destroyers seize gold and leave its owners a counterfeit pile of paper. This kills all objective standards and delivers men into the arbitrary power of an arbitrary set of values. Paper is a mortgage on wealth that does not exist, backed by a gun aimed at those who are expected to produce it. Paper is a check drawn by legal looters upon an account which is not theirs, upon the virtue of the victims. Watch for the day when it bounces, marked, account overdrawn. Genre. The novel includes elements of mystery, romance, and science fiction. Rand referred to Atlas Shrugged as a mystery novel, not about the murder of man's body, but about the murder and rebirth of man's spirit. Nonetheless, when asked by film producer Albert S. Ruddy if a screenplay could focus on the love story, Rand agreed and reportedly said, "That's all it ever was." Technological progress and intellectual breakthroughs in scientific theory appear in Atlas Shrugged, leading some observers to classify it in the genre of science fiction. Writer Jesper notes, Galt's motor is one of the three inventions that propel the action of Atlas Shrugged, the other two being wherein metal and the government's sonic weapon, Project X. Other fictional technologies are refract arrays, a sophisticated electrical torture device, voice-activated door locks, palm-activated door locks, Galt's means of quietly turning the entire contents of his laboratory into a fine powder when a lock is breached, and a means of taking over all radio stations worldwide. Riggenbach adds, Rand's overall message with regard to science seems clear. The role of science in human life and human society is to provide the knowledge on the basis of which technological advancement and the related improvements in the quality of human life can be realized. But science can fulfill this role only in a society in which human beings are left free to conduct the business as they see fit. Science fiction historian John J. Pierce describes it as a romantic suspense novel that is at least a borderline case of science fiction. The part entitled The Utopia of Greed, describing Dagny Taggart's experiences in the Hidden Valley, follows the general outline of utopian literature as established in Thomas More's original Utopia in 1516 and taken up by numerous later writers. Like in the earlier utopian literature, a visitor arrives at a land where special social customs and institutions prevail and is shown around by the inhabitants who explain how their society works, which gives an opportunity to expound in detail the writer's own social and political ideas. The definition of utopia as an imagined community, a society that possesses highly desirable and nearly perfect qualities, clearly applies to, as far as Rand is concerned, to the society of the Hidden Valley.